in Catholic social teaching, it's relatively clear that migration should not be considered a good thing in itself.
5 years ago, diversity is our strength was like the motto of every company or something, you know? And things were really soaring in that direction. And I think a lot of people now are saying, is it? Is it our strength? And people are worried that more immigration leads to some type of cultural erosion.
The fastest way to make this nation not Christian in its values is to make it hostile to immigrants.
Well, Dr. Barnabas Aspray, thanks for being here again.
It's a pleasure to be here again.
Third time's a charm. Second time here, but third time on the show.
Yeah.
Looking forward to this.
Very privileged.
You just released a book that you, how do we say this? Co-authored? Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, co-author. So it's in an edited volume. Everybody writes a chapter, but they don't take ownership of each other's chapters. Whereas if you're a co-author, it means that, in theory at least, all of you are taking ownership of the whole book.
Okay.
Although in practice, of course, I wrote it with a Jewish scholar, and there's chapters on Christianity and chapters on Judaism, which obviously I had more input in the chapters on Christianity and he on Judaism.
That makes sense. And so it's on religion and immigration. Nothing controversial there.
Yeah, well, I mean, my first book was on an obscure 20th century French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, which doesn't make it into the news headlines very often. So this is a bit of a different experience. It's part of a book series put out by Routledge called Religion Matters. And the point of the series is to explore the influence of religion on all kinds of global affairs and sort of international interests like climate change, democracy, violence, conflict resolution, those kinds of things. And I wrote or co-wrote the one on immigration policy.
I love it. And it's a great read. It's also available online for free for people to read. So I'll link to that. They can also buy the book. And that'll...
Yeah, I mean, anybody can buy a physical copy if they want, but I don't know why they would, because you can download the PDF for free online. Actually, all of the books in the Religion Matters series are available open access to download. That was one of the principles that the series editors wanted to lay down. They wanted this to be as accessible to the public as possible, because it's not just a book for academics. It's not just a book for other professors to read. It's a book for policymakers, for anybody who's interested in immigration policy or religion or the intersection between those.
And it seems everyone's interested in immigration right now. So I'm really interested to have this conversation.
It's not a hard sell, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I liked the stuff on Paul Ricoeur, but, I think maybe more people will be interested in immigration. The thing that's really interesting to me from the outset of this project, religion and immigration, is that they're really big categories, and how they intersect, I imagine, isn't always clear. Like, it's not a one-to-one. If one's Christian, then they believe this all the time. And so I guess, how does that, talk me through the process of, the levels at which this is happening, of how do two Christians who seem to be committed Christians, they've got the same text, and they come to radically different positions on immigration. How then do we kind of account for the role of religion in all this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is the first thing I've ever written that didn't have a Christian audience in mind from the start. And in some ways, I was trying to answer the question, what do Christians think about immigration? But of course, anybody who is a Christian knows that there's no one answer to that question. There's a whole host of different points. And I should also say that in this book, I don't give my own personal opinion on that. What I'm doing is presenting all of the other arguments available that Christians think about immigration. And yes, there's a lot of different viewpoints. What do you want to drill into specifically?
Well, I guess, so I mean, if the project is religion and immigration, and it seems that part of it is to look at the role of religion in shaping one's thoughts about immigration policy, or how a policymaker should think about religion as they're kind of considering making immigration policy. Do you think it's the case that, I guess, to really drill into it, like, Christians come to different conclusions on this? Is it because the Bible and different churches just have kind of a multiplicity of teachings on this subject? Or is it, some people are applying and some people aren't?
I think it's sort of a case study in how more than we ever want to admit, sometimes our politics and our cultural situation can drive our understanding of our faith rather than the other way around, right? Just because somebody self-identifies as a Christian doesn't mean that all of their views are steeped in a Christian way of thinking. We're all influenced by whatever period in history and whatever culture we're raised in as well. And that can affect the way we approach our faith, and especially the Bible, which all Christians hold in common. There's obviously multiple ways of interpreting the Bible, and some of those interpretations are more plausible to somebody who comes from one cultural context than another.
Yeah, and so here it seems we have a couple levels of things. We have, what does the Bible say? And like you say, we all hold that in common. And today's not going to be a Protestant Catholic thing, so we won't talk about how many books are in said Bible. But we have, at least a great portion of the Bible in common.
But there's plenty of verses that Catholics and Protestants have in.
We've got
the
more
said
than enough to
Bible,
work with.
yeah.
Yeah. So we've got the Bible. Then you have our interpretation of the Bible, like what the church teaches, and then how we kind of put this into practice. And it'd be nice to always be able to draw like a straight line from these things. Like the Bible says it, therefore I conclude this, and therefore I do that. But it's not always quite that simple, is it? And so how does that show up in immigration?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a convergence point, immigration, of so many things that Christians have disagreed on over the centuries. The relationship between faith and politics is one big one, how to interpret the Bible, whether faith is primarily a personal individual thing or whether it's a public political affair, and also what it means to be Christian in the first place, or more broadly, what it means to be religious. I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that we call Christianity a religion. I know some Christians like to say that it's not a religion, it's a relationship and that kind of stuff. But from a broader public perspective, it fits all the criteria that normally belong to a religion. The thing is, religious people can understand their own religiosity in more than one way. What does it mean to be religious? One of the other authors in this Religion Matters series actually produced 7 different definitions of being religious or of religion that are all valid depending on who you talk to. And me and my co-author, we wanted to reduce it down to the 2 ones that were most relevant for immigration policy. And we came across, essentially, there's 2 ways of understanding religion that make a difference when it comes to thinking about immigration. One is religion as communal identity, belonging, in other words. That could be belonging just to a church community, or it could be a nationality, it could be a national identity. There's a lot of people in some traditionally Christian countries, say, take Spain, for example. I've talked to Spanish people who are like, oh, you're from England, so therefore you're Protestant. And I'm from Spain, so I'm Catholic. Their Christian identity was based on their national identity. It doesn't matter what actual things you believe, it matters where you're from.
Yeah.
That's one definition of religion that actually a lot of people today hold. And the other one is perhaps the one more familiar to people who are into big theological debates, which is religion as a set of beliefs and practices, or a set of principles about how reality is and how you should live in light of that.
Yeah, and not to go too far afield here, but a reminder of the fact that you're doing a great series on your podcast right now about Christian nationalism. And I'm just curious, as you say that, when you define, religion could be national identity, we won't do a whole thing on Christian nationalism, but are those different concepts or are they wedded concepts? Does that make sense?
Oh, there definitely is a big overlap there, because it all depends on what we mean by Christian nationalism.
Sure.
And in my podcast, the first question we've asked every guest is, how do you define Christian nationalism?
Yeah.
Because everybody defines it differently. It could mean, I want my nation to be run by Christian values, or it could mean, I think my nation is in fact Christian and therefore non-Christians are not welcome here. Or it could mean, it could mean a lot of different things, but it's very relevant to immigration policy precisely because this is where the question comes: how do I secure the Christian identity of my nation, and how do I maintain the fact that my nation is going to be Christian? Is it by keeping all of the non-Christians out of the country?
Yeah, and that wonderful podcast is called Faith at the Frontiers. You guys should check it out. Link
Faith
in
at
the
the
description.
Frontiers, and the most recent series is on Christian nationalism.
Wonderful, wonderful. I got that in there. I told you I'd find a way to get that in there. It's a wonderful podcast. Barney didn't want me to plug it, but I did. In any case, I want to talk about this idea of Christian values because it's such a, to me, a loaded idea in this conversation around immigration. And it's fascinating that it seems to be used to defend like seemingly opposite positions on what we should therefore do about immigration. And so let me, I guess, sketch out what I see as the tension, and then we can kind of wade into that. On the one hand, we have people who may be taking Christianity as a set of doctrinal beliefs and corresponding moral maxims or attitudes derived therefrom, which is saying, hey, because the Bible talks about welcoming the stranger or things of this nature, and we'll get into that, we should welcome the stranger. We should have, pro-immigration in the name of Christian values. Christian values are what are kind of leading us to do that. On the other side of it, there's this sense of, because I want to live in a nation defined by Christian values, I want to make sure that the demographic makeup of that country is primarily or exclusively Christian to protect those Christian values. And so Christian values are kind of being marshaled in these conversations to come to opposite conclusions about what we should do about immigration. What's going on there?
I mean, you've hit it exactly the nub of the whole problem right there. And I've even got a quote in my book from one of the studies that says Christian values, that very term has been used to promote pro-immigration policies and anti-immigration policies, depending on exactly the way that you've framed it. And I guess one of the questions we need to ask is welcoming immigrants a Christian value?
Yeah.
Normally, the people who use the idea of Christian values as a way of being against immigration are thinking of a lot of other values like traditional family values or the things that Christianity has different from Islam and Judaism, for example. We want to keep Muslims and Jews out because we want to maintain the Christian culture of our nation. I have a very interesting case study chapter in this book where I compare the responses of Hungary and Germany during the 2015 refugee crisis, when there were lots of Syrian refugees coming into Europe. And what was interesting about that is that the Hungarian government was saying we need to preserve Christian values, so we're not going to let any of these Muslims in. And the German government, or rather just Angela Merkel, almost unilaterally was saying we need to preserve our Christian values by welcoming these Muslims, because that is what our Christian values do. So it very much depends on how you understand it.
Hey, we'll be right back to this special in-person interview, but first I wanted to say a big thank you to my patrons. It's only because of my patrons that I'm able to make this show in general, and especially do these more resource and time-intensive in-person interviews. In fact, because of them, I've been able to fly out guests in the past, and I would love to do that more so that you can have these wonderful in-person conversations that you all enjoy. But to do that, I need your support. So if you consider supporting the channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity to see more conversations just like this. And when you do that, you'll get early ad-free access to all my videos, access to my Gospel Simplicity book club, and a whole lot more. So once again, that's patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Yeah. And so on the one hand, we could make this dichotomy of whether or not Christian values include welcoming the stranger. I do think there's this third group that I run into a lot in kind of the spaces I run in online who might say, yeah, it is a Christian value in a vacuum, perhaps. Or, yeah, like I see the text you're reading about welcoming the stranger, but in our context, we've got these competing goods, if you will, that we're working for, the preservation of our culture, the whatever people might marshal forth. And we've got this kind of mandate from either scripture, or I've got a lot of Catholics who, follow me online, and they'll say like, look, I know the Pope says this is important, but in our current context, there's just too many mitigating factors and other things are more important than this right now. Do you see that kind of third element there? Or do you think we can kind of group it into two camps and one's just kind of like paying lip service to it?
Oh, I think we really shouldn't group it into just two camps, because that's exactly what the sort of polarized culture of American politics and European politics to a certain extent likes to do. Yeah. Either you're pro-immigration or you're anti-immigration. It's that simple. Either you want all immigrants to come to your country or you don't want any. And I don't actually think anybody really holds either of those sort of completely black and white positions. And when we're talking about immigrants in the abstract, it's almost a bit silly. Like, what kind of immigrants are you talking about? Are you talking about people who have lost their homes and are fleeing their country because they would be killed if they stayed there? Or are you talking about a tourist or a wealthy merchant? Or, there's so many different kinds of immigrants. It's really a bit ridiculous to lump them all into this one big category and say we're for all of them or against all of them.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that about you and your work. You're very good. And something that amazes me, I didn't even tell you this before, and I don't think I commented on it, but I saw you like so patiently trying to talk through this with someone on Facebook where like dialogue does not often go well. But I saw you commenting, and it's like, okay, the thing that you're arguing against, do you think anyone would say, yes, that represents my position accurately? Because that's what we want to do, right? And when it comes to immigration, like, say I'm anti-immigration, whatever that means. I wouldn't want someone, defining my position as, okay, hate everyone, like don't let anyone, like if what you're arguing against doesn't resonate with me as like, that's what I actually hold, we're probably not going to get anywhere.
That's right. I tried my very best in this book to fairly represent all the different views that I'm describing in that book, even the ones that I don't hold myself. I may not have done it perfectly. It's very hard to do perfectly, but I tried to show that both the pro and the anti-immigration positions at their strongest or in their best light, as it were.
Yeah, and this is somewhat maybe methodological, maybe like a bit of a tangent here, but I think an interesting and difficult thing that I've run into in this is that I find myself often like so committed to, at least I think, maybe I'm deluding myself, but to trying to represent other positions fairly, to, be as broad in my understanding, to be charitable in my kind of reconstruction of others' positions, to try to understand it. And sometimes it like feels like it can be hard on certain things to like muster up conviction because you're like, yeah, I see how you see it that way. I see how, and so how do you balance that on like, this isn't a topic of just mere kind of theological opinion in the sense of it has no like real world ramifications. Like it's a really important topic. And so I wonder just like in your own life or as you're thinking through things, how do we balance being fair, being charitable, but also being willing to say like, I think there's right and wrong here. Like this isn't, everyone always uses this example, but like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Like this isn't mere speculation.
Yeah, it affects a lot of people's lives, millions of people's lives around the world, how Christians actually think about this topic. And so there's a lot at stake. And I do feel very passionately about the views that I have arrived at. And that's what makes it hard sometimes to remain open to being persuaded by arguments against that particular view. But in some ways, that only makes it all the more important to remain open, because ultimately we need to keep the dialogue open. We need to keep debating this, even in order to have a chance at convincing other people of our own views, as well as in order to have our views changed if they turn out to be the wrong ones.
And maybe this is beyond the purview, I don't know, but why do you think it's gotten so bad in terms of like, this seems like a topic that is all but like off limits for people who disagree to have like, I don't know. Yeah, you've been here long enough. Do you celebrate Thanksgiving with anyone when you're here?
We have the last 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like, it's a common thing, like at Thanksgiving, you don't discuss religion and politics, right? Like, but you want to be, polite, whatever. Like bringing up immigration at Thanksgiving dinner just seems like it would be a recipe for absolute disaster. Why is that?
I don't think immigration is the only topic of which that's true. I think immigration is just one instance of a number of different topics like climate change, sexual ethics, gun control, lots of different things which have become subject to the polarized discourse, to the tearing apart of Western politics into these two different camps, or these two different sort of package deals. So in one sense, immigration is just one sort of particular instance of that one particular case study in a broader problem, which is how do we restore dialogue? How do we actually take each other's views seriously and seek the truth together, instead of just dismissing the opponent's view as nonsense because a bunch of things that I've read online prove it to be nonsense.
Yeah. Or just watched a TikTok on. Reading might be asking too much there. Okay. So I want to get into some of the details here, because I think we've kind of mapped the territory a little bit. But at some point, I think
And
there's...
you can be hard on me.
Oh, okay.
Push me.
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
If I just put it simply, like, what does the Bible say about immigration?
I think the kinds of immigrants in view, especially in the Old Testament, I'm going to focus mainly on the Old Testament in this case, the kind of immigrants that are being discussed in Old Testament law are almost always people who are in need. They've lost the normal means of support, financial support and means of living. And so the Bible seems to me very strongly to say if there are such people in your country, in Israel in this case, then it is your duty to give them the support that they need, to welcome them, protect them, look after them, and integrate them as far as you can.
And so the term that's often used here, I didn't take Hebrew, I took Greek and Latin, so I'm not even going to try it. But it's the stranger, right? Is that the main word? You talk about it in your book, but I guess, is that what is really in focus here, or is that even wrong to focus on that?
Well, there are 4 different Hebrew words for stranger.
Okay.
There's a general word for just any foreigner who's probably still in a foreign country. There's a word for a sort of hired slave or passing traveler. There's a word that sort of means whoever's not in the group I'm talking about. Sometimes that word zar is used of normal Israelites when Levites are being discussed. So it's like the priesthood. The zar is the non-priest. So and then there's the word ger, which is the main word. That word appears 70 times, or perhaps more than 70 times, in the Old Testament law, in the Pentateuch. And that's the word, the key word, which all of the Old Testament law talks about, how you should love them, how there should be one law for the citizen and for the ger, how you should welcome them and protect them and, provide for them and that kind of thing.
And is it right then to say that when the ger, G-E-R, right, is how you...
G-E-R is how we would put it, render it in English, yeah.
So is it right that this stranger, this foreigner, you said, is primarily someone who's like economically destitute or has to move for reasons outside their control or something like I thought you were talking about that in one sense. Would you say that's usually in view in these kind of 70 times, or just sometimes in view?
It's controversial because there's so much at stake in understanding these right, and again, this is where politics very often drives the religious discourse rather than the other way around. You will find voices who say the ger, the right translation of ger is legal immigrant rather than illegal immigrant. In other words, sure, you should welcome and protect and integrate anybody who has followed legal procedures to enter the country, but you don't have to do that if they're illegal. You don't have to love or welcome somebody who's an illegal immigrant. That's not the majority view, I should say. That the majority view in the scholarship is that the ger is somebody who is in the country not of their own choice, like they would rather have stayed in their own country. And if you think about it in the ancient world, there's no real reason to leave your country unless something really badly is going wrong in your own country. There's a war, there's an invasion, or you're being persecuted by your own equivalent of government, your own king or whatever. So if Israel finds some of these kinds of people in its own country, the only reason they could be there is because they're in desperate trouble. They've lost their family, they've lost their land, and they're on the breadline, as it were.
Yeah, I know it's my job to push back here.
Yeah,
but
please do.
Well, I'm going to struggle to do it for a second, but I will do it eventually. The reading of ger as legal immigrant, just on the face of it, I'm not the expert here, but like it seems like a blatant anachronism in some ways. Like, in that, like, were there immigration laws at this point in the way that we're thinking of? Like, that maybe I'm just wrong here, but it sounds so foreign to me.
Well, it comes from a Old Testament scholar called James Hoffmeyer, who wrote a book, I think in 2008, called The Immigration Crisis,
Ah,
which I think one of the first sentences in that book is, we have a problem, and we as American citizens, right, we have a problem of illegal immigration. And in this book, he's actually an expert on ancient Egyptian archaeology and culture. And he provides a lot of evidence that ancient Egypt did have borders and it had various procedures to allow people in, which I would say is not necessarily surprising if you think about it, because it was one of the wealthiest countries in the ancient world, because it had the Nile and it had a lot of fertile ground. And so everybody's going to gravitate towards the country where all the food is coming from. And then they're going to find themselves in a position where they want to put up some borders. But then what I think James Hoffmeyer does, which is not entirely legitimate, is he transfers a lot of these ideas and says, well, ancient Israel must have done the same things. Right? Which I'm not sure quite works, especially if you look at the context in which the ger appears in Old Testament law. It doesn't seem that the Old Testament law is that concerned with whether this person has followed legal procedures, even if such exist, to get there. It's much more concerned with the simple fact that they are in desperate need.
and this seems to get us to one of the first, well, probably not the first, but what we might call like hermeneutical chasms or something. That's a slightly pretentious way of putting it. But one of the gaps between ancient Israel and us today. And I guess my question for you would be, I can see the parallel that I guess maybe Hoffmeyer's trying to make, is that Egypt was this flourishing place where people would want to come of their own will, perhaps even, like maybe they wouldn't be, economic refugees or anything like this. Like, it's just, that's where the food is. That's where the commerce is, if you will. That, maybe not that, but let's go there. And I imagine what he might be doing, or what I can just say I could see people doing, is America's kind of like that. It's this place where there's a lot of opportunity. There's bread, and there's all of these things. There's jobs and whatnot. And so we're in a place where more people want to come than maybe some people think is possible for the country to have come. That's maybe a slightly separate question of whether or not that's true. But I guess my question for you, to bridge the gap to ancient Israel, is, were they ever in that position? As Israel is enacting these laws in the Old Testament, were they ever a place that like people were really psyched about going to? Or was it just a place that, a couple people might kind of straggle in because of wars that were going on? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if ancient Israel was ever in that sort of position of being the wealthiest nation in the surrounding area, it would have been during the time of Solomon, I imagine, or during the time of Omri, who's discussed very briefly in 1 Kings 16. But funnily enough, all of those Old Testament laws about welcoming and protecting the ger are already there before that time, right? They're written originally either by Moses or shortly after the time of Moses. So I don't think that's really the primary concern of those Old Testament passages. The ger is almost always mentioned in conjunction with two other people, widows and orphans, right? So you get this refrain all the way through the Pentateuch: widows, orphans, and strangers, you need to do this or that too. You need to always some kind of protection and provision for. And the reason is, those are the people who can't support themselves, who can't provide for themselves, who lack the means or the access to look after themselves, and who thus need support. What makes ancient Israel so unique is that they care at all about those kinds of people. If you compare the Pentateuch, the ancient Israelite law, with the laws of the surrounding nations like Babylon, Moab, Assyria, all that kind of thing, what really stands out is that there's no mention of strangers in any of those. Perhaps once or twice a stranger is mentioned almost in passing in those laws. But even then, it's not because of any sort of duty to look after them. It's some incidental issue. So what really stands out as a huge emphasis in the Old Testament law is its immense concern for these people who can't provide for themselves and who thus need some sort of care and protection.
So if we were try to bring that to today, I know we've thrown out already a couple different terms, and maybe it'd be good to kind of disambiguate them a bit.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got immigrants, and we've talked about legal and illegal immigration slightly, just gestured at it. But then we've talked about refugees. I think I used that word. And we might say like asylum seekers. I don't know how much that all overlaps. But what I'm hearing so far is, okay, there's this real concern for the people who can't care for themselves, the people who are on the move, not of their own will. And so would you say that the clearest kind of thing to map that onto is something like a refugee today? And if you would or if you wouldn't, maybe we can start by saying refugee versus immigrant. How do those categories relate?
Yeah, for sure. And this is where it really gets controversial, right? It's how to apply those biblical passages to today and whether the kinds of people trying to get into the country are sort of what you might call economic migrants. That is, people whose life was pretty good in their own country, but it could be better if they moved to the States. And so that's what they're trying to do by illegal or legal means. That's the way a lot of the discourse tries to present them. The real distinction is between a migrant and a forced migrant. I think that's the most important distinction we want to drill into here. A refugee is somebody who's been officially recognized by the government as a forced migrant. They've sought asylum. So an asylum seeker is somebody who arrives in a country and claims asylum, claims that they are there because they would have been killed or imprisoned if they had stayed in their own country. Then the government has a duty to investigate that, and if they decide that that is correct, that the country they came from is not a safe place for them to return to, then they grant them the status of refugee. So what's really at stake is what makes somebody a forced migrant versus a migrant. What makes somebody count as having been forced to flee versus choosing to flee? Because in a deep philosophical sense, like, they're still choosing to leave the country, right? They could stay, they'd just be killed if they did.
Right.
And like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has its own definition of a refugee, a definition of somebody who the nation has a duty to protect, who has the right to seek that kind of protection from a nation. It's somebody who, owing to their political opinions or religious opinions or ethnicity or a whole long list of things, is at risk of persecution from the government in their own country, and has fled their country in order to preserve either their life or their freedom, basically. You can look up the formal terminology in the UNHCR, but that's the general remit of what counts as a forced migrant. It's very individually focused. It often has in view somebody who is being individually targeted by the government as being persecuted. And a lot of people have criticized that definition because it doesn't take into account the phenomenon of mass migration, the phenomenon of like 10 million Syrians having to flee Syria due to the civil war. What do you do with them? Their government isn't individually persecuting them, but they've still been forced to flee. Their homes have been burnt down or blown up by bombs or whatever, and now they can't go back there. They don't have anything to go back to. It's the same with a lot of Ukrainians, right? They don't have anything to go back to Ukraine for. They've lost their home, so they need to stay here. I think what makes the question so controversial is how many of those kinds of people are on, say, the US-Mexico border versus how many of the people who are just economic migrants who are seeking a better life and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, and even that seeking a better life seems to have blurry lines. Like,
totally.
What standard of living could we say is something that forces someone to, again, force is a difficult word here, but I don't know. I imagine it doesn't seem like it's an easy thing to adjudicate when someone, essentially we're saying like, no, you're well enough off where you are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. And there's this whole category of when does somebody count as an economic migrant versus as a refugee? How bad do things have to be before that it made sense for them to leave their country and come to another country. The thing is, I feel like sometimes a lot of the discourse seems to try and assume the worst about the migrant, assume that their life was actually okay elsewhere, rather than assuming the best about them. Because, of course, you can't have all of the information to hand. Sometimes you just have to take their word for it. And at the very least, we can safely say that the vast majority of people, say, on the US-Mexico border, are in pretty desperate situation. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. Like, most people don't want to migrate. Most people don't migrate out of choice. Why would you leave your own country and your own culture and your own language and everything you're familiar with and go to another country unless things are pretty bad for you where you were?
Yeah, and it seems this is the point that gets debated a lot. I think it's a tricky thing. It's like, how do we characterize those who are seeking to enter this country or various prosperous countries or any country for that matter? And is it okay, these people are in dire straits, this is like a last resort, or is it they want a better life and they think they can have that here, and maybe they can, but lots of people here want a better life, and so
And we should prioritize our own citizens. That's the sort of discourse, isn't it? Yeah.
right, yeah. And I don't know, I struggle with it because on the one hand, I mean, I'm generally like a hard on your sleeve type guy. We probably agree on this topic too much, but it's not my job to agree today. Um, but I also get that, like, I'm doing this interview from the comfort of a home here, that I've got a decent life, that I think there's a lot of people in this country who are saying, like, I'm barely making ends meet. Things are really hard for me right now. And there's a sense of, like, more competition is going to make things harder for me. And by more competition, I mean more people looking for jobs, more people looking for housing, more people looking for whatever it is. And look, like, I'm sorry that these people are facing hard things, but, like, I am too. And I was here first, and this is my country, if you will. Like, I don't know. I want to hold space for that, because I think that's a very real and strong feeling that people are having. And, is there not an argument to be made that, okay, like, yes, we've got multiple problems here, but we should focus on poor Americans before we, extend this limited number of resources to other people?
Absolutely. That's an important argument and deserves to be taken seriously. Because as you say, it's easy for us who have relatively stable, secure positions and relatively wealthy compared with a lot of very poor Americans. It's easy for us to say, oh, we should welcome all these immigrants. Like, my job's not at stake. And I said this when I lived in England as well, which when I was actually a citizen, now I'm an immigrant here. But when I was in England, I was like, my job's not on the line because of all of these refugees and immigrants coming in. Whereas somebody who works in construction or just manning a shop or something, their job, they do feel the competition with all of these immigrants, and they feel like, well, surely my country should be looking after me first. I'm a citizen. And I think that argument should be taken very, very seriously. But as a Christian, I feel like the bottom line of care and love and support and welcome should never be thought of as a sort of zero-sum game where you give some to one person, that means that the other person didn't get it. I know we tend to think that economics works that way. There's a limited amount of resources, and so somebody's going to get them, and that means somebody else doesn't get them. But I even don't think in the economics it really works that way. Economic growth is all about finding the fact, like discovering that there's more resources, that more resources can be produced with more people there to work on them, that even the limitations are not actually fully limiting. And we don't need to pit poor American citizens against poor immigrants. We can actually see that both of them can be provided for, and they can even help each other and support each other. I mean, we should just think about it at a purely economic perspective for a second. Does the addition of an extra person into the country, do they drain the economy or contribute to the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say contribute to the economy.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously they're going to be spending money, or they're going to be using resources. They're going to be eating and living in a house and that kind of stuff. But if they have a job, we're going to assume they have a job here. They're also contributing back to the economy. And that means they're actually producing resources that other people are then consuming. So I don't think there's an economic case against immigration. I've talked to a few economics experts about it, and they say, like, from a purely economics perspective, immigration is always good for a country. And I'm sorry to say it, but even illegal immigration, from a purely selfish perspective, illegal immigrants are a kind of underclass that make the lives of everybody who's legally here better. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but from a purely economic perspective, there's no case even against illegal immigration.
I think on maybe a slightly different level of the economic scale or the tax bracket. I don't know if this is entirely fair, but I think another thing I hear is not so much from the people who feel like, okay, these people are taking my jobs or whatnot, but no one likes paying taxes almost ever. That's almost a universal fact, I think. Most people don't enjoy it. And I think there's people that feel, okay, if we allow more people into this country, we need more programs for these people. And, maybe they'll contribute to the economy at some point, but, it's the processing, all of this, it takes time and money. And if we have more programs, there's going to be more taxes. And Barney, I just hate taxes. I don't know if that's as serious of an argument, but I think when you ask that question of drain on the economy versus contributing to the economy, I think there's probably like a macro and a micro scale to that people might think like, okay, maybe the economy as a whole gets better, but like I feel like it's hurting me. I don't even know if it might be a stretch to correlate those things at all, but I imagine people feel that way.
There's a lot of other reasons that you're paying taxes that have nothing to do with immigration. I think that constitutes, about 1% of your concerns. Like, there's a lot of other ways to reduce taxes before we have to start thinking about what the government does for immigrants. And that's one of the things that I find slightly insidious about this whole conversation, that immigrants are very often used as the scapegoat, as the thing to blame for the problems going on in America or in Europe, where I'm from. And in some ways, it seems like a distraction, a misdirection, because if you look at what is really causing the problems, what is causing the problems in the economy or whatever, immigrants are not even close to the top problem there, but immigrants are being used by politicians as the scapegoat, as the reason that your taxes are so high and you're barely making ends meet and all this kind of stuff, when it's actually just not really true.
Yeah. I think there's two other areas this comes up in which there's either scapegoating or people feel it's true. One area is crime, which I think we have pretty good statistics on that.
Yeah, we do.
It looks like something like scapegoating, but you're the expert here.
Well, from a purely statistical standpoint, an American citizen is more likely to have committed a crime than an immigrant. And you can look at those statistics up. They're freely available all over the internet. So if we're worried about crime, if crime is one of the things that is driving our concern about immigration, a far better thing to do would be things like reforming the police force, training the police better, or pouring more money into the police force, rather than just trying to kick out immigrants. American citizens are more likely to commit a crime than an immigrant.
The other one I want to look at is culture. And this is one that kind of circles back to this idea of Christian values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a sense from people of, it's interesting, I'll speak to my own context first. In America, I was often taught as a kid, America is this beautiful melting pot where people from all over the world have come to make it a better place. And maybe that's just like one window of time in which that was the narrative we taught in schools. But like, that's kind of what I was given. Like, it's this wonderful melting pot where people come from all over the world, they achieve the American dream, and look at us, and we maybe throw on some like religious language, like we're the city on a hill or something like that.
Yeah.
Conversation for another day, maybe on that. But I think there's a sense now of people feeling like that melting pot is getting too diverse. There's been an interesting backlash of, especially I'd say, 5 years ago, diversity is our strength was like the motto of every company or something, and things were really soaring in that direction. And I think a lot of people now are saying, is it? Is it our strength? And people are worried that more immigration leads to some type of cultural erosion. And I want to do this justice because I think people can kind of hand wave it. But there's a conservative comic who's like clip on YouTube kind of surfaced, and he was on he was an immigrant to the UK. He was on like Sky or one of the UK things, and they were saying that he was racist for saying that the England was becoming less English, and he just asked them. He's like, if tomorrow we replaced all the English people with Scottish people, would it be less English? And they got very tongue-tied, and it made for a very good, kind of type of internet clip. But I think that's a maybe silly hypothetical, but there's people who feel like, well, yeah, I mean, if we have mass immigration, especially from people that aren't interested in assimilating, is often the way that this is put, then yeah, it becomes less American or less British in some essential way. And it does seem that that's primarily concerned with certain groups of people. I don't see too many people saying like, man, Barney, like if all your friends come from the UK, like we're just going to have terrible food in Baltimore, but at least like there'll be more bars that show
food,
the Premier League games. So like, I know you don't watch soccer. We'll talk about that some other time. But I would say that'd be a good thing, a little bit more Premier League games on, but I just, right. But it does seem that this is directed towards certain groups of people, but I don't know.
You think there's a valid concern in that? Yeah.
I want to say that I don't think the response of it's impossible that a culture changes a lot because you change the demographic of people in it is an absurd idea. Like a culture is in some ways the sum of the people there. And so, if everyone in America spoke, what's a non-controversial language? Korean tomorrow, like would it feel less American? I don't know. Maybe. Is that a crazy idea?
Yeah, I do think that's a valid concern. And sometimes people on the left of the spectrum like to say, oh, multiculturalism is great. The more multiculturalism, the better. We just want a big melting pot of cultures. And actually, I don't think that's a fully coherent position. So I do think there's a valid concern there. And, speaking as a Catholic, in Catholic social teaching, it's relatively clear that migration should not be considered a good thing in itself, which might surprise you, because the Catholic Church has a great deal to say about the importance of welcoming immigrants and all that kind of stuff. But they say, actually, it would be even better if we could address the root causes of migration globally so that fewer people migrate because fewer people feel the need to flee their home. So we're not necessarily saying that we just want to mix all the cultures together as much as we possibly can. There is a concern about wanting to preserve the distinctives of all of the different cultures in the world. I don't think that Western culture, taken as a culture, stripping away the moral values in there, I don't think that Western culture is any better than any other culture in the world or any worse. Every culture deserves to be preserved, and it deserves to have its own sort of boundaries and its own right to preserve itself. The thing is, I think when you're talking about people fleeing their own country because there's a civil war or because of famine or whatever, Western culture is not the most under threat there. It's their culture, the immigrants' culture, that's most under threat. So it's almost like, I think, the urgency of protecting people whose lives are at stake should take priority over this general desire to preserve our own culture and our own language and all that kind of stuff. But this raises a larger problem, which perhaps you want to speak to as well, about the need for assimilation or integration or segregation. Is that where you wanted to?
Yeah, I think it's a related problem in the immigration question. I don't hear it quite as much in the U.S. When I eavesdrop on British politics, this seems to come up a little more. Maybe I'm just completely wrong there. But maybe I just think of it because America's so big, and but it does seem that there's a concern that people aren't assimilating into that culture, they're not integrating, and that therefore it's going to erode the culture, or you're going to have rival cultures within a culture.
For sure. And it should be said relatively clearly that immigrants also have a duty. Immigrants also have responsibilities. If you think of the analogy of inviting a guest into your house, the guest has a responsibility to be civil in that house, not to like destroy the furniture or just do whatever they want. They have a duty to conform to the rules of that household. And the immigrant has a duty to conform to the rules of the country that they've been in, for whatever reason they're in that country. So integration is important, but that's a duty on both sides. And I would say integration is the sort of middle point between two undesirable alternative extremes, as it were. So you've got segregation, where the immigrant community keeps to themselves, doesn't bother to learn the language of their country, doesn't bother to learn the laws. They just try and create a sort of little isolated bubble of their own culture within the country that they've come to. And I think we can all agree that that's not a good thing. Why they're doing that, it might be because they don't feel welcome. It might be because they feel threatened by citizens, so it might not be entirely their fault, but it's certainly not a good thing. The other thing that I would say is not good is assimilation. Assimilation is where the immigrant completely loses every aspect of the culture that they came from. They don't ever speak their language anymore. They don't bring their own like food or clothing or whatever. They just completely become a citizen of the country they came to. And I think that that's not a good thing either, insofar as every culture deserves to be preserved and every culture has good things about it. And there's a good thing about cultural diversity as long as it's not in conflict. The middle point, I think, is integration. Integration means I learn the language. I put some effort in as an immigrant to conform to the values and rules and norms of the country that I'm a guest in. But I also bring a richness to that country that everybody can benefit from. And if you think about it, every culture is actually a product of a mix of a lot of cultures that preceded it, right? You think of a lot of the main things in Great Britain that people value, like tea, comes from China. Playing chess comes from Persia. A lot of the things that we tend to think of as core Western cultural values actually come from elsewhere in the first place. And there's all the more in America than it is in Europe. So I don't think of culture as a sort of zero-sum game either, where if I lose some of one, if I gain some of one, that means I've lost some of another. I mean, my wife is a good example of this. She's from Switzerland, but she became a naturalized British citizen a few years ago. And she speaks almost perfect British English. You've heard her talk. Like most people think she's just British. She's taken on a lot of the values of British culture in the way that she cooks and in the way that she talks to people. But she's also lost nothing of her Swissness. She's still 100% Swiss. Mm-hmm. It's not that by taking on some of British culture, she's lost some of Swiss culture. It's not a sort of zero-sum equivalent there.
Yeah. And it's also not, I'll speak broadly to culture, a static thing either. I think we'd like to think of Britishness as this static and essential thing, but it's not, right? Like it does change over time. I mean,
the favorite food of the average Brit is an Indian takeaway.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case 200 years ago, you know.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I guess that becomes this question of there will be people that celebrate that and don't celebrate that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, it's so, as you said, even more true in America. And I would like this kind of middle ground thing that you talk about here. I think about my own family history and, my, I guess, great-grandfather on my mom's side, came from Italy. And when he came, he was very passionate about, I will never speak Italian again. I won't teach my kids Italian. Really? And my parent, or like my mom and then mom, I guess, to a lesser extent, but I know talking to my mom, she's like, I feel like we really lost something. Like, why didn't he teach his kids Italian? Like, why did he never, but that was the far end of like the assimilation side. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want people to think of me as Italian. I want to be just American. But then on the other side, you have if he never learned English, he probably would have lost something of integrating into America.
And it's also just disrespectful to the country that you've arrived in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, even as we use like the word disrespectful, obviously things like this take time, right? So like if someone, shows up and they don't speak perfect English, or if I moved to Korea and I didn't speak perfect Korean the first day.
Well, often they've showed up in a hurry because they've been escaping to save their lives.
Yeah.
You can't expect them to speak perfect English right from the start.
Yeah. And I think, there is an aspect of like, if people really like having great different food in this country, right? Like you don't have that, for instance, without some type of melting pot. Without melting pot's maybe a bad image because it's like things, I don't know. But
having more food options doesn't destroy the existing American food options.
Right. Yeah. I don't see a lot of people lamenting the fact that, they can walk down the street and get all these different types of wonderful foods. Like people talk about that as the great benefit of a city, right? That it's not just the diner down the street or something like that. There's one thing we haven't touched on that I think is important in this conversation. It's something that you've done a lot of work on, and it's the idea of Jesus as a refugee and whether or not that should impact our policy. And there's I think a couple other kind of more brass tacks questions I want to get to towards the end, but
sure.
Let's talk about that idea, because I think it's another one of those talking points in this discussion. Like Christians love to debate this stuff. Like you're either being a bad Christian because you're not doing this, or like they throw verses back and forth, they throw ideas back and forth, and this is one that comes up, that Jesus was a refugee. One, what does that mean? Two, should that change how we think about immigration?
Yeah, so I've written a journal article called Jesus Was a Refugee, Unpacking the Theological Implications, which is also freely available to download via open access. And of course, that's not a completely uncontroversial claim, even though most people tend to admit it. If you dig into the details, you might say, well, Jesus didn't fit the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees definition of a refugee that was established in 1951 and all this kind of stuff. The Roman Empire was large and he just moved from one part of the Roman Empire to another, all these kinds of things. But at the same time, I think when it comes to the practical details, Jesus and his family fled the culture that they were in, that they'd grown up in, went to a culture that they were unfamiliar with because of a threat to their lives, or because of a threat to Jesus's life at any rate. And that's all we really need to have the idea of a forced migrant, right? So most Christians love, if they're supportive of welcoming strangers and welcoming refugees, they love to say that Jesus was a refugee. And very often they don't really go any deeper than that. It's sort of self-evident that Jesus was a refugee, so therefore you should welcome strangers and all this kind of stuff. But I wanted to go a little bit more deep into that in my article, and I wanted to explore why Jesus was a refugee. I try to argue in this article that it's not a coincidence, it's not a sort of accident, that it was actually divinely ordained. The Gospel of Matthew says this occurred to fulfill a prophecy. In other words, Jesus had to be a refugee in order to fulfill his role as the Messiah. And I argue that the reasons for that is, first of all, he was recapitulating Israel's story. Forced migration is at the heart of the Old Testament stories about Israel. In fact, I would argue that the three most significant events in the Old Testament are all forced migration events. The being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are refugees. The Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites flee Egypt because they're enslaved there, and the exile, when the Israelites are invaded and carried off to another country. They're all forced migration events, and this just shows you how much the Bible really cares about this issue. But I was arguing that Jesus actually recapitulates that in order to show himself as the true Messiah, the true representative of Israel, and even the true representative of all of humanity, if you go back to Adam and Eve. And he also not only recapitulates the past, but he provides a paradigm for the future for all Christians. If you look through the rest of the New Testament, it's very clear that the church needs to consider itself as in exile. The Apostle Paul says our citizenship is in heaven. in First Peter, the churches in Asia Minor are addressed as the church in exile, the aliens and strangers in the world. The church needs to see itself as not belonging in any place in the world. It's a transnational community. And that has huge implications for the way Christians think today, because we need to think of ourselves as primarily belonging to heaven, not to whatever country we come from. We shouldn't feel entirely at home, even in the country we grew up in, if we're Christian. And it's a problem if we start to feel too much at home there, because if we start to feel too much at home in our own country, that's when we get hostile attitudes towards immigrants. We tend to think of them as invading our country. Well, it's not our country. Our country is heaven.
Yeah, that's good. It's one thing that strikes me in those stories, and I really like the way that you kind of traced that through salvation history, if you will, to use kind of a theology term, is that one thing that strikes me is often the Christian is in the position, or the Israelites, or what have you. In each of these stories, it's about the person in exile, if you will. So the story of Eden is about Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden,
Yes.
forced migrants. The Israelites in the Exodus, they're forced migrants. Babylonian captivity, all of these things. We've got forced migrants. I think the difficult thing maybe that Christians are being asked to do, I'm probably showing my cards too much. Oh well, is to flip that, at least in the modern West, right?
Yes.
Is that I don't feel like a migrant. Like I live like, I don't know, 20 minutes from where I grew up, like, not very far away. But I'm being asked, what then should I do about these other people who, at least in a more tangible sense, are migrants, are forced migrants, right? Like I think we often pay lip service to the idea of like, yes, this isn't my home, and like in a way I'm a foreigner in a strange land or something. But like for all intents and purposes, like I feel pretty comfortable here, all of that. And I'm now being asked, what do I do as, the Egyptians, as the Babylonians? Maybe that's not quite right, but like as the group in which these migrants are coming to.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's plenty that the Bible says about that too. Like, I'm going to write another book about this, by the way, because the book that has just come out doesn't have my own argument in my own opinion. So I'm going to write another book next year, which gives my own theological argument for a particular thing. And what I'm going to do, that book's going to be in two halves. The first half is going to be surveying what the Bible has to say about the experience of being a migrant, being a refugee, which is what a lot of biblical verses that we've just looked at talk about. And the other half is going to look at what the Bible has to say to the host about refugees. That is, what it says to people who are in the country that they came from and how they're supposed to treat immigrants. We looked at some of those verses already, right? Love and love and stranger. There's one Bible verse that joins those two categories, though. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 10, where it says, you shall love the ger, the vulnerable stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, most of the Old Testament law doesn't give you a reason for the law, right? It just says you should do this, and if you don't, God will punish you, or you'll be subject, or whatever. But this one gives a reason. Why should I love the immigrant? Because you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. Now, what's funny about that verse is that most of the people to whom it applies were not strangers in the land of Egypt. They had been living in Israel for possibly hundreds of years and were perfectly comfortable and happy there. So in what sense is it true to say that they were strangers in the land of Egypt? It's only true in the sense that their deeply rooted sense of identity as an Israelite goes back to that time. Those are the stories that they tell each other. That's how Israel forms its own self-understanding, its own sense of self, its own identity. Its own identity comes from an experience of exile, an experience of being the stranger. And that should change the way we see strangers. So they're no longer other, they're no longer them. But we should recognize how hard it is for strangers. Even if we haven't experienced it ourselves, our ancestors did. as Christians, we attach ourselves to the identity of Abraham. Abraham was in exile. So if we remember those stories and tell those stories and steep ourselves in the biblical literature, we'll find that we have more natural compassion for immigrants because we're inhabiting a story in which we, the people of God, were immigrants many, many different times.
Yeah, and I think this is a wonderful call to really return to the scriptures and to inhabit that story, to make that our own, right? Because, there's a lot of ways of defining who we are. And, it goes back to that original thing of how we even think of religion. Like, am I an American? And because I'm an American, I've kind of imbibed this certain American flavor of Christianity as part of my identity, that I filter the Christianity through my Americanness? Or is it kind of vice versa? Like, I live first and primarily into this biblical story, but I do that in my own context as an American.
And as we discussed, one of the main arguments of the book, or it's more just a sort of result of a lot of different studies that I quote in the book, is that a general trend that does have exceptions to it seems to show that Christians who understand their Christianity as associated with communal or national identity are more likely to be hostile towards immigrants, to want to keep immigrants out, because they identify the church or their own Christianity with certain territorial borders. But people who see their Christianity more as a set of beliefs and practices tend to be more welcoming towards immigrants, presumably because they've steeped themselves in those beliefs. They spend a lot of time in the Bible. The Christians who spend more time reading the Bible and dwelling on the biblical literature are more likely to be welcoming of immigrants. There are exceptions, of course. We talked about this Old Testament scholar, James Hoffmeyer. He knew the Bible really, really well, and yet he made an argument against welcoming the illegal immigrant. But it's a broad demographic trend.
Yeah. And maybe one way to problematize this, or to kind of, get into the implications is there a point, maybe I'll just put the question bluntly here. For a Christian, is there ever too much immigration?
Yeah, I don't think there's any of the Christian principles require you to make a national policy in which you let terrorists in, for example. If somebody is known already to be a terrorist, then UN law and no Christian theology says you should welcome somebody into a country any more than into your house who you know is going to do damage, who you know is going to cause harm and be a threat. But what really goes on most of the time is that people are suspected of being terrorists when there's no evidence that they are, or that this one terrorist out of 100,000 people is then used as an excuse to keep all of those other 100,000 people out who are actually in desperate need.
Yeah, or to just get rid of due process. Out loud voice, sorry. No, okay, so I want to, I know you already talked about the kind of attitude of abundance, or superabundance.
Yes.
But one thing that comes up in this conversation, and we've kind of hinted at, is if maybe you don't have that idea and you think, okay, how do I take the resources I have? How do I prioritize this? And this, in a fascinating way, came to light over like a Twitter X debate last year between the vice president and the Pope, in a way, as they talked about the Ordo Amoris, right?
Indeed.
This question of, okay, sure, yeah, we're supposed to, I'm maybe not doing J.D. Vance justice here, so let me know if I'm not, but it's like, sure, we're supposed to care for the stranger, but in proportion to, the order of loves. Mm-hmm. And so we love first our family, next our community, then our nation, and finally those who aren't in our nation. And I think the implication being, well, we just might run out at some point in those concentric circles, or, if it was like, if caring was like giving, I don't know, gold coins to each person, like, sorry, person on the furthest end of this concentric circle, we just don't have any left. But I would if I could, but I can't.
Absolutely. I mean, the way J.D. Vance put it It was that you love first your family and then your nation, and then if there's any love left, you can give it to strangers. At least it seems from the way the US government is operating, it seems they don't have any love left. But and he says it's a Christian principle. I think it's such a fascinating moment in the history of Twitter or X, right? How many times does theological Latin get over 10 million views and all this kind of stuff and become the center of a huge furor of debate? But what is the Ordo Amoris? I think we should actually just explore it, because the best way to respond to J.D. Vance is to say, has he understood the Ordo Amoris correctly? There are some Protestants who would say, well, the Ordo Amoris is not actually a Christian principle anyway. You can't find it in the Bible. But from the Christian tradition has always seen in there sort of a basic common sense idea. I have 2 daughters. I spend a huge amount more time and money and effort on them than I do on anybody else's children. And I feel that that's what I should do. And basically, everybody throughout all of history and every culture has always seen that their own family should take priority over other people, and that's the core insight in the Ordo Amoris. But if you go down into the sources, say take St. Augustine for example, he says, funnily enough, he says the first thing he says in his sentence is all people should be loved equally. That's not what J.D. Vance said. Then Augustine goes on and says, well, but since you can't actually provide for everybody equally. He admits that there's certain limitations on our resources. He says you should provide for those who are placed in closest proximity to you. But he doesn't spell out what that proximity is. Is that ethnic proximity, family proximity, physical, geographical proximity? He doesn't say. So it could be interpreted any number of ways. It could mean that the homeless person on my street I have a duty towards them rather than to the homeless person on the other side of the world. It could mean that the immigrants knocking on the borders of my country have a priority over the stranger in need who's in their own country, for example. So that's one source. So of course, the other great source for the Ordo Amoris is Thomas Aquinas. And we have a look at what he says. He goes into quite a lot of detail on the Ordo Amoris because that's his way. But right near the end of what he says about the Ordo Amoris, he says something that might surprise most people who favor it. He says, there will be times when you should prioritize the needs of a stranger over those of your own father, if your father's not in such desperate need. In other words, the amount of urgent desperation that somebody is in is a factor. If your own family is relatively well provided for, and the stranger is in a desperate situation, then you should actually prioritize the needs of the stranger. So the Ordo Amoris is actually complex. And the other thing that should be said about it, by the way, is that nowhere in Aquinas or in Augustine, 2 of the great sources for this, is one's own fellow citizen one of the sort of concentric circles. So the idea of having a priority for those of your own nationality is not necessarily there. That's something we're reading back into the Ordo Amoris rather than taking from it. But the idea of who is in more desperate need actually features.
Yeah, and I'll say, from my own perspective, one early Christian writer I'm thinking of is like St. Basil, and how he talks, like, I think if people want to root a certain pushback against immigration policy, it's probably too strong, but I think trying to root it in like the fathers or something like that is it's actually going to problematize it. I think when I read someone like St. Basil, I think he would have much more issues with how we're treating the poor than saying we're doing too much in most cases.
Oh, for sure.
He talks about not leaving any money for your children because there's too many poor to take care of right now. Like if you have 2 cloaks, and you're not giving your other one away, that is more. He
says it literally belongs to the poor person who doesn't have a cloak, and he doesn't mean it rhetorically. He means that actually they own it, and you should be giving it to them. You're stealing if you're not giving it to them.
Yeah. I want to balance that though, because despite my stated purpose of pushing back, I'm not sure how well I've done it. But on the one hand, well, I don't know. I guess I can say I look back at the fathers, and it seems like, the if anything, there's more care for the poor. It's
Absolutely.
more radical. On the other hand, I wanted to ask you about what you learned from co-writing this book with the Jewish author. And I know
Yes,
that
yes.
one of the things from conversations I had with you when you were writing it was a desire to push back on any narrative that went too cleanly of like, well, the Bible teaches to care for the poor and Christian theology teaches to care for the poor. And so Christians should care, or I'm sorry, not the poor, the immigrant, the stranger,
Yeah.
and the poor. But,
Yeah.
And from what I sense in that was there was a desire from him to say, yeah, but Christians haven't always done this well, and we need to recognize that. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so every volume in this series, Religion Matters, was meant to be co-written by practicing members of more than one different religion. So it was myself and a Jewish scholar who co-wrote this together, and that meant that it was a site for interreligious dialogue. And I have to say, one of the things I learned from this process is that interreligious dialogue can be hard, even if it ends up being worth it. And the first draft of my chapter on Christianity and immigration, this Jewish scholar really, really didn't like, and said he wasn't willing to take ownership of it as something that we've written together, because I basically made the theological case that the Christian tradition says we should welcome and care for immigrants, and ignored the fact that most Christians throughout history haven't always done that. And he said I needed to be more honest and more critical of my own tradition, saying that actually there have been times when Christian countries or even the church has been very hostile towards immigrants and very anti-immigration. So I ended up writing a whole section in the book which looks at the medieval treatment of Jews. And of course, this is why it came up in the interreligious dialogue problem, because as a Jew, he is very conscious, he still has deeply embedded in his memory the way Christians treated Jews in the medieval and early modern period, and wanted me to take ownership of that and be honest about that. So I had to write about the way Spain expelled all Jews and all Muslims from its country in 1492. It was Jews in 1492 and then Muslims about 10 years later. And look at their theological arguments and their theological reasons for doing so.
And what were those arguments?
Well, they basically said these people are causing trouble in our country. They're trying to convert Christians to Judaism. And there was an analogy of Spain as like the body of Christ, and of anybody who's not a Christian as being like a foreign body, like a germ or a virus that's infecting the body. We need to get this out, basically. Or in Italy, or not Italy, the Papal States. A lot of people forget that there was a time when the Pope was not just the head of the church. He also owned his own territory that wasn't just the Vatican. And he wrote a document where he expelled all Jews from the Papal States. And the analogy used there was the analogy of bread with yeast as a contaminating factor in it. I think I'm getting that right. A little yeast poison or sours the whole dough, something like that. It's an analogy that comes in the book of Galatians, chapter 4, actually. So it doesn't completely it's not without biblical precedent, but he basically says we need to get this out so that the bread is pure. Yeah.
And well, I say obviously, the Catholic Church today doesn't take that same tact, right? I mean, the past two popes especially, but I don't think only them, have been very pro-immigration.
Yeah.
And by past two, I mean the current and Pope Francis.
Yes.
I don't know where Pope Benedict XVI landed on these things, but what changed? Like, and this isn't a Catholics have changed their mind, but like, I could hear. I want to maybe just give a little bit of space for the person who says like, well, yeah, if we take our religion seriously, then we should want our kids growing up in a society where they're not being evangelized by people who don't share the Christian religion, and maybe those guys were right. I just want to put these things on the table because I think people will be asking.
Oh, for sure. We need to take these arguments seriously, all the strongest arguments against the kind of current policy. I think a cynical person might say, well, the Catholic Church is more welcoming towards immigrants now because it has less political power than it did. And it's a lot easier when you have less political power to say really nice things about what politicians ought to do, even though that's very hard to do in actual practice. But perhaps, I mean, the truth is there wasn't any official Catholic position on immigration until about 1951, which was the first papal encyclical that was written about the migrant. The Pope was acting in his capacity as the political head of the Papal States, and he was writing the papal bulls in that capacity, not acting as the Pope presiding over the global church, as it were. And that distinction, it doesn't excuse what the Pope said and did, because that was, it doesn't change what he said and did, but it does mean that he wasn't laying down policy that all Catholics from thenceforth should follow in the way that the popes in the 20th century have done. And you're right that Pope Francis and Pope Leo have prioritized the Catholic Church's teaching on the welcome of migrants and strangers, but they're not innovating really at all. They're drawing on a long tradition that goes all the way back to the 19th century that has always said that. So they're not really taking the church in a new direction. They're just emphasizing something that the church has always taught. But I want to address the real concern that you have there, which is the problem that if we welcome too many immigrants who are not Christians, this is a problem that we saw being raised as a concern in the 15th and 16th centuries. The problem that if we let too many non-Christians into our country, we're diluting the Christian values of our country, and it's ultimately going to undermine and erode the Christianity in our country. And shouldn't we do something to defend the Christianity and the Christian values of our country? Because I think that's a concern that, as you say, a lot of people are going to raise. I guess in response to that, I would say that if you are being hostile towards immigrants and not welcoming immigrants, that's a Christian value, to welcome immigrants. So you're actually undermining the Christian values of your country yourself. You're actually departing from Christian values if you don't welcome immigrants. The fastest way to make this nation not Christian in its values is to make it hostile to immigrants. But that is a paradox. That doesn't completely answer the question, because there's still this concern. What happens if we let all of these people into this country? We're going to lose all of these Christian values. I think the real answer is to go deep into the theology of what power is in the gospel. And to say, Jesus says things like, those who lose their life for my sake will find it, whereas those who seek to preserve their life will lose it. Or the Apostle Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 12, my power is made perfect in weakness. I boast all the more about weaknesses, because when I am weak, then I am strong. And I think what we should see is a call for Christians not to be defensive or to feel like they have to take control, but a call for Christians to say, if you follow the gospel principles, even when it sometimes looks like it makes you weak and vulnerable and under threat, if you're following those gospel principles, you need to trust that there's a deeper power in the gospel presentation, a sort of cruciform power, power in being crucified, that you can trust. God will preserve his church. God will preserve the Christian faith. You don't have to do so using political force the way the world does. You can just trust that if you lose your life for the sake of the gospel, that you will find it.
It's not an easy thing to do.
Not easy at all. It requires a great deal of courage, and it always requires courage to be vulnerable, and it requires a great deal of courage for a nation to make itself vulnerable and to welcome a lot of people who don't share those same values. But I really think that's the heart of the gospel.
I think you're right. And it takes a lot of courage to write a book on this in this time. And so I want to point people to that once again. Final question I want to ask you. In your acknowledgments to the book, you thank people as people do in those, and you thank the people who disagree with you, the Christians who disagree with you, for sharpening your thinking on this or something along those lines.
Yeah.
What have you learned from people who disagree with you on this?
I've just learned, I guess, need a moment to think about that for a second. I think I've always tried to pursue this question in dialogue with all of the strongest arguments, both for and against the various positions available. And obviously, I think that the position I now have is the right one. That's why it's the position I now have. But I have arrived at that position through intense dialogue with people who agree and with people who disagree. And so in some sense, I wouldn't have the position I have now if I hadn't been dialoguing with people who disagree with me. And for people who still disagree with me, I'm still open to having my mind changed, because that's what dialogue is. Like, let's go on a journey of truth together. If anybody still thinks that I've made a big mistake and I'm not really representing what Christian values are, then reach out to me. Let's talk about it. I'll listen to you, you listen to me, and let's keep talking about it until one of us changes their mind based on the evidence.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that this video has been an opportunity for people to sit and listen to this important conversation. Like, it's one of the issues of our time, and I'm glad to have had this conversation with you, Barney.
Thank you so much.